My name is Hannah. Christina, Brandon, and I decided to do our nonverbal communication project on the concept of proxemics, or the study of how humans communicate space. Proxemics is a very interesting concept because all of us spend a great deal of time negotiating space throughout our day-to-day activities. Whether we realize it or not, the way we share space with others communicates many things about us, such as the respect we have for others, whether or not we have a good relationship with them, and it can even communicate success or failure. The way we carry ourselves, how we position our bodies, facial expressions, and gestures and body movement all communicate nonverbal communication, or nonverbal messages. The way we use space and recognize others' use of space is strongly tied to culture. Richmond, McCarthy, and Hickson, the authors of our textbook, Nonverbal Behavior in Interpersonal Relations, says that it is very difficult to fully understand proxemics without understanding culture. Basically, the way we use space is dictated by our culture. But to a certain degree, our basic approach to our use of space is inherent or instinctual. Culturally, research has found that North Americans feel more comfortable when they have more space between them. So, North American culture is often referred to as a non-contact culture. On the other hand, contact cultures tend to interact more closely with one another. An example of a contact culture would be Latin American cultures. But it is very important to not assume that it is true for all Latin American cultures or all North American cultures that we are contact or non-contact cultures, as there have been differences found within single countries. Another interesting point about proxemics is that gender plays a major role influencing our use of personal space. For example, females generally tend to interact more closely than males, but female and male pairs will interact more closely than a pair of males or female pairs. Some researchers have found that females are more comfortable allowing interaction to come from the right or left side rather from the front. So this is like side-by-side interaction rather than face-on interaction. As you have seen throughout this presentation, from this chairlift behind me, there's people sitting side-by-side in relation to one another. Some of the people sharing a chair know one another and others do not. Typically, a chair has 4 spaces for people, and so when 2 people get on a chair and they're separate, they'll usually sit on one side of the chairlift and the other side of the chairlift. Unless they may know each other or they're dating, they may sit on one side next to each other. So 2 people sitting on one side may indicate a close relationship with one another, while if they're spread out, it may indicate that they don't know each other very well or that they're strangers. If we see 3 people sitting on a lift, 2 people on one side and 1 person on the other side, we may assume that these 2 people are close in their relationship and that this other person over here may be a stranger or may not be as closely tied to the other 2 people. If we see 4 people sitting together, it kind of discounts the idea of proxemics in this case because there isn't much more room to spread out with 4 people. It is interesting to watch the amount of space each person takes up and how they might try to communicate how much space they wish to have. We might see men using more space by having their legs further apart, or we may see a person use the armrests in their immediate environment on the chairlift to separate or create space between another person. The amount of space that people behind me take up can communicate their relationship with one another or their comfort level within their relationship. As you can see, it's not a great day up here, and I was hoping to show you more people getting on and off the chairlift, but there have been a few people on and off, so hopefully you've seen a few examples of that. So with that short introduction to the concept of proxemics, I would like to discuss the article and study that our group chose to duplicate. The article is titled Proxemic Distance and Gender Amongst Australians, a Study of Side-on Distances. The study was published in 2011 by Laura Parker and Tara Leo. In this study, proxemics was observed on a public bench at a bus stop to measure side-by-side distances between the sitting people. All of the people in the study were strangers, and there were male and female participants. Markers were placed on the bench so that the researchers could measure the distance that people chose to sit from each other. The hypothesis stated that two males will sit closest, females the furthest apart, and mixed gender people will sit at an intermediate distance to that of their male and female pairs. In our duplicate study, we chose to observe people here in Oregon so that we could compare culturally differences in proxemics by using the Australian study. Brandon, Christina, and I observed people sitting on benches in a large shopping mall. We selected 3 different benches, placed markers on the edge of the benches so that we can measure people from a distance without them knowing that we're doing our study. The shopping mall gave us opportunity to observe people of different genders and ages. We hypothesized that because North Americans have been described as a non-contact culture, people will sit further apart than the Australians in the Parker and Leo study.
This is Christina, and I'm going to go over our experiment. Hannah gave us a really good overview of proxemics and what they are and why we should care, how they matter to us every day, and how they affect all of our interactions and communication with those around us. She also went over the original paper, the Parker and Leo research paper that was the Australian study done on this that we're going to try to replicate. So I'm going to go over our experiment and let you know kind of how we decided to go about things. Obviously, we're trying to duplicate the previous experiment as much as we can so that we can compare and the results. So the first thing that we had to do was choose a location. So we chose Washington Square Mall. We chose this place because we knew there'd be a lot of people around, and so we wouldn't have a hard time observing people sitting on the benches. And within the mall, we chose 3 locations that we were going to be observing, and we chose these 3 because there was a high amount of foot traffic, so again, we know we wouldn't have a lack of people to observe, and then also because all these benches were the same size, so we wouldn't have to worry about our data being skewed. So we observed 1 bench at each of our 3 locations that we chose within the mall. There was other seating around, obviously, that area, but we wanted to make sure that we chose the benches because we knew that they were going to be uniform in length so that we would get the most accurate results possible. The benches looked really similar to the one in the picture. It's not exactly the same, but close enough to show you guys what we did and how that all worked. All the benches were 180 centimeters in length, about 6 feet. Just a side note, for this experiment we are using centimeters because in the original paper it was an Australian study, and they used centimeters, so we figured that would be the easiest way to compare and contrast the results with that experiment, was to use centimeters. So from here on out, that's what we'll do our measurements in. So we took some colored dot stickers and put them 20 centimeters apart on the bench. We figured this was kind of a good distance apart to help us measure while we were watching. The people obviously didn't know they were being watched, so we had to have a way to measure from a distance without, interfering with how people were sitting. So after we selected our 3 locations and got the benches set up, we were looking for pairings of strangers. We were only observing 2 people at a time. Anything more than that would skew our results because there's obviously less room to choose from where you sit. So we're only looking for 2 people, and only strangers, only people with no pre-established relationships. Obviously, if 2 people walked up together and sat down together, we didn't record data on that pair. So at each of our 3 locations, we collected 30 sets of data, 10 sets of male-male pairings, 10 sets of female-female pairings, and then 10 mixed gender sets. And we did this again at each of the 3 locations that we were at. This table is one that we actually just copied out of the original research paper from the original study that was done. You can see it's got the same pairings that we were observing. They did it a little bit differently. They didn't do equal numbers of sets when they were collecting, so they have more data on the female-female sets than they do on the male-male or the mixed gender. But you'll be able to look and see the average distances and be able to compare and contrast them with ours. This table illustrates our results that we collected from observing our pairings at the mall. So you'll see that we have rows for each of the 3 locations that we were observing from. The other study only has 1, so our tables look a little bit different, but we tried to keep it as similar as we could, so you could best kind of compare and contrast the results. So I'll go over them really briefly because we are going to kind of go over the findings a little bit more in detail, but if you look, basically our hypothesis was pretty correct. Male-male sets sat as far apart as they could, really, on the bench. Females were more comfortable sitting a little bit closer, and then mixed gender even closer than that, although just by a little bit. So you can look at the numbers a little more in detail and compare them to the other table to get kind of an idea of what we found out. We also noticed a few of the concepts from the text and from the lectures occurring while we were trying to record our observations. They don't necessarily have anything to do with our experiment directly, but we did think they were worth mentioning. So in the original experiment, the people who were being observed were aware that they were being observed for something, they just didn't know what for. So the researchers were able to ask them to put any bags, any purses, any personal items behind them on the bench before they sat down. So there was nothing sitting on the bench to deter somebody else from sitting there. And we didn't have that in our case because they didn't know we were watching them. So we did notice that very often people would put bags, purses, umbrellas. One guy put his shoes on the bench, whatever, they had to kind of insulate themselves and block other people from entering their space, people they weren't comfortable with, strangers. So that was a concept that we talked about in class that was illustrated pretty clearly here. The other fact that I wanted to mention, it's not necessarily surprising, but it was interesting. We had a really hard time collecting any data on the male-male pairs. It took a lot longer waiting and watching because in most cases, when a male was seated at the bench and another male approached, he would look and clearly try to see if there was any other seats available, and if there wasn't, more often than not, he would just kind of hang out, just kind of stand by the bench or pace back and forth. They were a little more hesitant to sit down with a stranger. With the females, it was much easier. If that's where the space was, that's where they sat down. There was also a lot less hesitation with the mixed gender pairings, and when a male approached the bench and a female was seated, quickly sat down, didn't hesitate too much. So again, that wasn't necessarily something that surprised us, but it was pretty fun to watch happen.
Hi, I'm Brandon, and now that we have some background about Proxemics, I'm going to go over the specifics of our experiment and our findings to wrap things up. When trying to replicate Parker and Leo's experiment, we selected 3 locations from which to observe people sitting on a bench, so we may record the distance left between the 2 people. All 3 locations were at different benches throughout a shopping mall. The shopping mall was chosen because it gave us a location with a large number of people with different ages and backgrounds. It was also a good location because all the benches used in our experiment were of equal size, which was approximately 6 feet in length, which is roughly the size of the benches used in the Australian study. The only interactions we recorded were ones in which 2 people were seated on one bench. From each of the 3 locations, 30 sets of data were recorded. 10 sets of males seated next to males, 10 sets of females seated next to females, and 10 sets of mixed genders. Like the Australian experiment, we placed color-coded dot stickers on the bottom of the bench rails where we could clearly see them, but they would not be noticed by people walking by or sitting down. These dots were placed every 20 centimeters on the bottom of the bench with 9 colored dots in all. For the purpose of this experiment and comparing the results accurately, all of our measurements were taken in centimeters. We found that using this smaller unit of measurement instead of inches gave us a much more accurate result. As stated before, only instances of people seated on the bench were recorded in sets of 2, as opposed to 3 or 4 people seated on one bench, which would skew our results. So what did we learn from this experiment? Well, our results confirmed what we had originally predicted, which was in general, American culture dictates more personal space when interacting with people with whom we have no established relationship with. As our text stated, the male pairs sat the furthest distance apart. While we collected 10 sets of data on male pairs at each location, we did find that typical males chose to stand next to the bench or pace back and forth next to the bench rather than sitting on the bench already occupied by another male person. Female sets and mixed gender sets were much more likely to share a bench with a stranger, with female sets sitting slightly closer than male sets but further away than mixed gender sets. In all instances, regardless of gender, people only chose to sit on a bench with a stranger when there were no other available benches open in that area. As far as the differences between the experiments, both the Australian experiment as well as the experiment that we conducted, we can see that as a non-contact culture, Americans in general will feel more comfortable choosing to maintain a greater distance from others. The results from our experiment show that Americans do require more personal space, and that our hypothesis about the gender differences were true. It should, however, be noted that in the original experiment, participants were asked to put any bags or personal property they might have with them behind them before sitting down. Because we were observing people without their knowledge of our experiment, we did not have this condition in our experiment. In some cases, if a person had a purse or bag with them, they might place it next to them on the bench, allowing them to insulate themselves and prevent people from sitting directly next to them. However, in cases where there was no buffer, people still chose to sit a fairly consistent distance away. The results of both experiments show us that different societies have different acceptable distances when it comes to personal space, although there are other factors that need to be considered when drawing conclusions. Both experiments dealt strictly with personal space while seated. They didn't measure different distances while standing, engaged in conversation, or business transactions. Research has shown that side-to-side interactions may have different societal acceptable differences than face-to-face interactions. The study of proxemics is vast and also involves posture and other aspects as well. For the purpose of this experiment, we were unable to measure all of the different aspects that proxemics involves. Much more research and a bigger sample size across multiple cities and states will be needed for us to get a more accurate picture of just how much personal space the average American needs in their day-to-day interactions. This concludes our experiment and presentation about proxemics. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed our presentation.